It was supposed to be just another rainy emergency call, until the ambulance screeched to a halt. A white Mustang stood in the middle of the road, soaked, silent, and staring straight into the lights. It didn't move, didn't flinch, as if it had waited for them. When EMT June Halley stepped out, it didn't run, it led. Through the trees, through the storm, to where an old man lay dying beneath the pines. This wasn't instinct, it wasn't luck, it was love. Silent, wild, and waiting. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The rain fell in long, steady sheets over Eureka Springs, Arkansas, soaking the pine-covered hills and winding roads that clung to the Ozarks like veins etched into stone. It was early December, a Tuesday morning marked by fog that crawled low and thick, swallowing tree trunks and turning headlights into dull halos. The air was sharp with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth, and the sky, a constant silver, hung low with the threat of more rain. Every house along Highway 62 seemed to hold its breath, shutters rattling, chimneys puffing out smoke in nervous little bursts. Inside the humming warmth of an ambulance marked Station 8, EMT June Halley leaned forward, her fingers firm on the wheel, eyes narrowed against the mist-streaked windshield. At 38, June had the kind of quiet composure that made people trust her in chaos. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hazel eyes and a face weathered slightly from years of night shifts and winter calls. Her chestnut hair was usually twisted into a low, no-nonsense bun at the base of her neck. She was calm in emergencies but distant in crowds, a woman who laughed rarely and loved fiercely, though few saw the second part. Years ago, a flood had taken her younger brother, and though she never spoke of it, the grief had settled into her bones like the chill that crept through mountain cabins in January. Beside her sat Milo Trent, 23, new to the job and still bright-eyed despite the hour. His sandy blonde hair stuck out from under his cap, and his wiry frame bounced slightly with every pothole. Milo had a way of filling silence with stories, even if he often talked more than he listened. He respected June, even feared her a little, not because she was harsh, but because she didn't waste words. Everything she did meant something. Their radio crackled. Station 8, we've got a possible stroke, male, elderly, unresponsive. Location's North Slope, a mile past Larkspur Hollow. June acknowledged the call with a nod, even though no one could see it. Her eyes flicked to the GPS. The road ahead twisted through forest, narrowing as it climbed. She adjusted her speed and turned on the siren. But then, just past mile marker 47, the unexpected happened. A pale shape emerged from the fog, motionless and centered in the road. June slammed the brakes, tires skidded, the ambulance groaned to a halt. The figure stood its ground. It was a horse, a white Mustang, soaked through, its long mane clung to its neck in tangled strands. It was slender but powerful, the kind of creature that had survived storms and men and wild things. Its hooves were caked with mud, and its flanks heaved like it had run hard, but its stance was unwavering. The animal's eyes, dark and glassy beneath the rain, locked onto June through the windshield, eyes that didn't flinch from noise or light. "Holy," Milo whispered. "That's a Mustang. A real one. Wild stock, probably came down from the bluff." June didn't answer. Her fingers stayed on the wheel, frozen. The horse didn't move. She tapped the horn. Once, twice, nothing. The Mustang stayed rooted, not in panic, but purpose. June opened her door. The rain instantly drenched her. Cold stabbed through her jacket, but the horse still didn't bolt. Instead, it backed away 2 small steps, then stopped, watching her, almost pleading. Milo leaned toward the windshield. "You think it's hurt?" June didn't know. She took another step forward. "Come on," she muttered. "Off the road." The horse obeyed, kind of. It stepped to the side, just enough for them to pass. June returned to the cab, drenched and shivering. The moment she shut the door, Milo reached for the gear shift, but the Mustang walked back into place. It stood there again, right in their path. "That's not random," Milo said, frowning. "June, it's doing that on purpose." She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think it is." She tried again. This time, instead of guiding it away, she crouched, lowered herself to eye level. The horse didn't approach but didn't back away either. It turned its head, then turned its whole body, and began to walk, deliberate, slow, into the forest on the left side of the road. June didn't hesitate. She grabbed her emergency flashlight and motioned for Milo to follow. The trees swallowed them within seconds. The ground beneath the pines was slick with old needles, and a layer of fog hovered low, ghost-like. The Mustang trotted ahead, pausing every few yards to look back, as if to make sure they hadn't stopped following. "What is this?" Milo whispered. "A message," June said. She didn't believe in signs, not really. But something about the horse's presence cut through her usual pragmatism. Down a short slope, near the base of a granite outcrop, the Mustang halted. It stomped twice, nervously, its ears flicking. June scanned the clearing, and then she saw him. An elderly man lay crumpled on the wet ground beneath an old cedar. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue. One arm lay beneath him at an odd angle. No jacket, no shoes. His gray hair matted to his skull like cobwebs. June dropped to her knees. "He's alive," she said, already checking vitals. "Pulse is weak, breathing shallow. He's cold, damn cold." Milo scrambled for his radio. "We found him. Male, unconscious, possibly stroke or exposure. Sending coordinates now." While Milo relayed the information, the Mustang paced, circling them in tight loops. Not panicked, just urging, as though time mattered, as though it knew. Within minutes, they had Clemeth. Milo spotted his wallet, secured to a stretcher, and carried up the hill. When they reached the ambulance, the Mustang tried to climb in. June paused. She met its gaze. "You want to stay with him, don't you?" The Mustang didn't whinny, didn't rear. It simply stepped forward again, nudging at the door with its soaked nose. June hesitated only a second longer. Then she opened the rear doors wide. The Mustang stepped in, carefully, and lay down at Clemeth's feet, rain still dripping from its mane. Not wild now, just waiting. The sound of the rain softened as the ambulance doors closed behind them, sealing in warmth, urgency, and something else. Something not yet named. The white Mustang lay motionless at Clemeth Doyle's feet, his head lowered, breath slow and measured. June Halley sat across from the animal, watching its rib cage rise and fall in tandem with the old man's. She wasn't sure who was comforting whom. As they sped through the winding hills of Eureka Springs, June's thoughts churned. The way the horse had led them, the way it had refused to leave. She'd seen animals loyal to people before, dogs mostly, but this, a wild Mustang, unshod and lean, acting with such precision, such purpose, it clawed at something ancient inside her, something that refused to be explained. Milo Trent, hunched over the radio, relayed vital stats to Mercy Hill Hospital. His voice was steadier than before, but his eyes darted often to whisper. That was the name he'd started calling the horse, not out loud again, not yet, but in his head, as if afraid to give something that sacred a name too soon. Mercy Hill was a small-town hospital built into the edge of a granite ridge, its red brick exterior softened by years of ivy and rain. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay just as the clouds broke again into sheets of water. Waiting under the overhang was Dr. Estelle Ramsey, head of emergency medicine. In her mid-50s, Estelle was short, square-shouldered, with curly gray hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck and crow's feet that deepened every time she squinted in suspicion, which was often. She had grown up in Eureka Springs, raised by a mother who ran the town's post office, and a father who disappeared one October morning and was never found again. That disappearance had seeded in her a deep distrust of mysteries and miracles. She didn't believe in signs. She believed in charts, symptoms, and lab results. She did not, however, believe in horses entering her ER. "Absolutely not," she said flatly as June began to open the rear door. "You are not bringing livestock into this hospital." "He's not livestock," June replied calmly. "He's a witness, a guide." Estelle crossed her arms. "He's a mud-covered animal that could cause a panic." But then Clemeth, barely conscious on the stretcher, shifted. His lips trembled. A soft exhale, more breath than voice, escaped him. The horse raised its head, ears pricking toward the sound, and something about the stillness between them, patient and beast, made Estelle pause. "Just once," she muttered. 15 minutes. Then he goes. The Mustang stepped gently down from the ambulance, his hooves echoing on the linoleum floor like hesitant drum beats. Inside the trauma room, the nurses, two of them, both in their 20s, named Tina McCall and Aaron Briggs, froze when they saw the animal. Tina, tall and freckled with a sharp sense of humor, took a cautious step forward. "Is this therapy now?" Aaron, softer spoken, with warm brown eyes and a tight bun that never loosened, just stared. She'd once worked in equine rescue before nursing school. She recognized something in the horse's bearing, its gentleness, the way it didn't spook under fluorescent lights or the beep of monitors. They moved Clemeth into place. The Mustang padded in after him, lowering its head near the rail. For a moment, the machines were the only ones making noise. Then something changed. Clemeth's fingers twitched, his eyes fluttered, and in a voice sanded down by time and injury, he rasped one word. Whisper. June exhaled so deeply it hurt. Later that evening, as Clemeth was stabilized and moved to recovery, June and Milo stepped out into the now drizzling dusk. Whisper had been led to a covered side enclosure, offered a trough of water and dry hay. He hadn't touched either. Maybe he's waiting for someone, Milo said, watching the horse stand with his head toward the building. Or something, June murmured. They didn't talk much on the ride back to the station. But that night, June couldn't sleep. Her dreams were full of hooves on wet pine needles and voices that never formed words. The next morning, she returned to the hospital before her shift. Whisper was still there. So was someone else. A woman stood near the enclosure, holding a faded flannel jacket over one arm and a photograph in the other. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair braided over one shoulder, a narrow frame in jeans and hiking boots, and eyes the exact storm gray shade as the sky above. Her name was Marlon Doyle, Clemeth's wife. They hadn't lived together for over a year. After Clemeth had suffered a minor heart attack, he'd grown distant, moving into the cabin full-time. Said he needed quiet, Marlon said, not meeting June's eyes. Didn't want me to worry about him slipping away in my sleep. She looked at Whisper. He took that horse in when it was just a colt, found it after a brush fire near Limestone Creek, said he didn't choose it, it chose him. June nodded slowly. He led us to him. I mean, literally, down the slope, straight to the spot. Marlon placed her hand on the fence. Clemeth doesn't trust easily. He was like that even before the army. Always read people like maps, figured out who would stay and who would vanish. That horse is the only thing that never let him down. Whisper finally drank some water that evening, after Marlon stroked his neck and whispered something only he could hear. The halls of Mercy Hill Hospital smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet wool, a strange combination brought on by the continued presence of a Mustang outside its doors. Though the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, Whisper remained at his post beneath the slanted overhang near the emergency entrance. The hospital staff had grown used to his silent vigil. Some even began leaving cut-up apples or dry oats nearby, though he rarely touched them. He didn't spook when stretchers rolled past or when sirens howled. He simply stood, head low, eyes fixed on the door that led inside to the man he had not left. Inside, Clemeth Doyle was slowly beginning to breathe on his own again. The stroke had left his right side weak, his speech reduced to slurred fragments, but his vitals had stabilized. He lay in a quiet room at the far end of the second floor, propped slightly up by pillows, surrounded by monitors that blinked with soft, repetitive life. Despite the machines and wires, he looked more like a man asleep beneath a storm than one recovering from it. June Halley visited every day, always off duty, always with a quiet nod to the nurses and a cup of gas station coffee in hand. Her eyes no longer carried the same guarded stillness they did before. Something in her had been unlocked by that horse and this old man's bond. She began asking questions about Clemeth's cabin, his life, how long he had known Whisper. But Clemeth had yet to answer. His mind, though returning slowly, was still adrift in fog. Milo Trent visited less often, more out of guilt than interest. He wasn't good at hospitals, too quiet, too still. He left a sketch once, a pencil drawing of Whisper standing under the rain, head bowed, eyes closed. He taped it to Clemeth's wall without a word and slipped away before anyone could thank him. Meanwhile, Sarah Holt, the hospital's speech therapist, was assigned to Clemeth's rehabilitation. At 45, Sarah was a patient woman with a soft, worn voice and eyes like pale sand. Always observant, always assessing. She was average in height, a little round in the shoulders, and always wore long patterned cardigans that looked like they belonged to someone's grandmother. She had once dreamed of being an opera singer, but after her mother's sudden stroke when she was 18, she redirected her entire life toward helping others find their voices again. Sarah believed healing didn't begin with words, it began with familiarity. And in Clemeth's case, that meant Whisper. She approached June one afternoon in the staff lounge. "If we can get the hospital board to approve a therapy exemption," Sarah explained, "I think we can bring the horse in regularly. He may be the only stimulus Clemeth responds to." June hesitated, unsure. "You really think it'll make a difference?" "I think," Sarah replied, smiling faintly, "we're already seeing the difference. He said the horse's name. That means recognition, emotion, memory." Convincing the board was not easy. Estelle Ramsey, pragmatic as ever, voiced concern about allergies, liability, sanitation. But Sarah had records, case studies, and a compelling argument. If this animal had saved Clemeth's life, perhaps it could help him reclaim it. So the compromise was set. 1 visit a week, 30 minutes, with staff supervision. Whisper was led into the hospital again 3 days later, this time through a side elevator, normally used for maintenance carts. Erin Briggs, the quiet nurse with equine rescue experience, volunteered to guide him. The moment Whisper stepped into Clemeth's room, something shifted. The beeping monitors seemed quieter. Clemeth turned his head. His eyes, dulled with exhaustion, brightened ever so slightly. Whisper stepped forward, paused beside the bed, then lowered his head to Clemeth's hand. At first nothing happened, then Clemeth's fingers moved. They curled slowly, shakily, into the tangled wetness of Whisper's mane. Tears slid from the old man's eyes. His lips moved again, cracked and dry, barely shaping a breath. This time it wasn't just a name, it was a sigh of recognition, a tether to something real. "Whisper," he said, clearly this time. Sarah, standing in the doorway, wrote the word in her notebook. June just watched, a warmth swelling beneath her ribs she couldn't explain. The visit continued in silence. Whisper stayed close. Clemeth never released his mane. Outside the hospital, another presence had taken notice of the white horse. Lucas Bray, a local rancher and one of the few remaining horse breeders in Eureka Springs, stood behind the wrought iron fence lining the hospital parking lot. He was in his early 60s, with a sun-leathered face, a limp from an old rodeo injury, and the gaze of a man who measured everything twice. Dressed in a denim jacket and worn leather boots, he watched Whisper with an expression caught between awe and suspicion. He recognized the horse, not by name but by the scar on its left flank, the half-moon-shaped mark he remembered from a roundup years ago. "That can't be the same colt," he muttered to himself. Lucas didn't approach. Not yet. But something about the animal tugged at an old memory, the kind that wouldn't stay buried. He made a mental note to return later, maybe with a few old photos. Something about this was beginning to feel too familiar. Later that week, June returned to Clemeth's room to find a surprising sight. He was awake, not just conscious, but present. Sitting slightly more upright, eating soft pears from a tray with trembling hands. Marlin sat beside him, her silver braid tucked neatly behind her ear. Her smile was tired but full. Clemeth looked at June and offered a faint nod. "You came," he rasped. June didn't smile, but her eyes lit with a rare softness. "Always." Whisper stood in the hall, looking in through the glass. He didn't need to be inside to be part of the moment. He knew where his place was. The days stretched longer as December deepened in Eureka Springs, the frost lingering until midday and the pines dripping icicles like glass teeth. Inside Mercy Hill Hospital, time felt suspended, but in room 208, something rare was unfolding. Clemeth Doyle was not only surviving, he was returning. It started with words, quiet ones, croaky, misshapen syllables that slid from the side of his mouth like stones dropped into a creek. Water, yes, Whisper. But each word grew steadier, as though he were pulling them back from somewhere dark and frozen. The nurses began scheduling fewer vital checks. Sarah Holt increased his speech sessions to twice a day. Even Dr. Estelle Ramsey, who had grumbled through every non-medical theory of his recovery, admitted quietly to June that something bigger than science was at play. Clemeth's wife, Marlin Doyle, was at his bedside most mornings, always in those same worn jeans and trail boots. She carried a notebook now, a little leather-bound thing she once used for grocery lists, now filled with fragments of memories Clemeth whispered. Recipes, timber measurements, lyrics from old country songs. "You remember the fire?" she asked one morning. Clemeth, eyes distant, nodded. "Limestone Ridge, 10 years back." He spoke slowly, hands fidgeting with the blanket's edge. "The whole sky was orange. Ash was falling like snow. I was driving back from town when I saw him, small, limping, tangled in barbed wire." Whisper had been a colt then, barely old enough to fend for himself, his white coat streaked with smoke and mud, a fresh cut slashed across his left flank like a crescent moon. Clemeth had pulled over, climbed down the rocky incline without thinking, took him in without a second thought. Back then, Clemeth's workshop had still been standing. He'd built cedar rocking chairs and hand-carved bedposts for the nearby lodge. Customers said his furniture breathed, like it remembered the trees it came from. But after a heart scare 3 years ago, the orders stopped. He closed the shop, sold the truck, and retreated to a cabin further up the hill, where only Whisper remained for company. On the 4th morning of Clemeth's recovery, Lucas Bray returned, not through the hospital doors, but from the rear gate where Whisper's enclosure stood. He carried an old Polaroid photo, faded at the edges, but still clear enough to make out the image. A white Mustang colt, wild-eyed, caught mid-leap in a corral. The same scar curved along its flank. "Whisper." Lucas called softly, "Hey there, boy." The horse turned, ears flicking at the familiar voice. Lucas had once run cattle drives through the Ozarks, had trained horses in summer rodeos when his knees still worked right. He'd nearly bought that colt after the fire rescue a decade ago, but the animal vanished from the pens one night, along with a stranger who left no name. That stranger, he now realized, had been Clemeth Doyle. Later that day, Lucas met June outside the nurse's station. "I don't want trouble," he said, tucking the photo into his vest, "but I think I know where that horse came from." June tilted her head, guarded. "You think he was stolen?" "No," Lucas said. "I think he ran to the right man." Lucas was a man who chose words carefully. His voice had that southern rasp of someone who had smoked in his 20s and quit too late. His beard was mostly gray, but his eyes were sharp. He handed June the photo. "I figure fate works stranger ways than we like to admit. Thought you should have this." She looked down at the image. The colt looked like a ghost of the Whisper she knew. Same fire, same stillness in the eyes, but rawer. Younger, wounded. Meanwhile, back in room 208, Clemeth had asked for something unusual. "Can I see the boy?" he said to Sarah. Sarah paused mid-session. "Which boy?" "The sketcher. The one who drew my horse." Milo Trent, though surprised, agreed to come. He entered the room later that afternoon, hands shoved in the pockets of his EMS jacket, clearly out of his depth. He looked smaller somehow in the sterile light. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Clemeth nodded. "You saw something in him. Whisper. That drawing, it's how he feels, not how he looks." Milo glanced at the wall where the sketch still hung. "I guess I just understood." The two sat in companionable silence. Then Clemeth, voice quieter, added, "You ever lose someone?" Milo didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. "My dad," he said. "Cancer. I was 16. I still check the door sometimes thinking he'll walk in." Clemeth nodded. "You see? You know what it's like when something stays, even after it's gone." Whisper continued his weekly visits, each one more relaxed than the last. He began eating again. Erin Briggs, who now took over his feeding and care, spoke to him as she brushed out his coat. "You're not just a miracle," she said softly. "You're a mirror." Erin, though quiet, had a fierce loyalty to creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. After a childhood accident left her younger brother with a speech disorder, she had spent years learning patience, not just with people, but with pain. Working at the hospital was her way of keeping that promise. 2 days before Clemeth was cleared to begin walking therapy, Sarah brought in a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a hand-carved horse's head, smooth and shining, with eyes that gleamed like real ones. She placed it on his windowsill. "You remember carving this?" she asked. Clemeth's hands hovered over the grain. "Mesquite," he whispered. "Carved it for Marlin. She liked the way it looked into the sun." Marlin, watching from the doorway, blinked hard and smiled. The frost came early that morning in Eureka Springs, frosting pine needles and blanketing the rooftops in a hush of white. It was the kind of morning that asked for silence, for slow footsteps and warm breath caught in cold air. Inside Mercy Hill Hospital, discharge papers were signed with a rustling finality. Clemeth Doyle, leaner now but steadier, dressed in the flannel shirt Marlin had brought him, the same one he'd worn years ago when he first brought Whisper home. His movements were cautious, his cane a borrowed steadiness, but his eyes held a quiet light, the kind of gleam not born of youth, but of having come close to the edge and turned back. Outside, parked quietly at the bottom of the ramp, was Lucas Bray's horse trailer. He stood beside it with his signature limp and a small nod, a gesture that meant more than words. Lucas had offered to transport Whisper back to Clemeth's hillside cabin, a way of honoring the connection he had once nearly broken by trying to buy the colt all those years ago. Some animals, he had said earlier that week, don't belong in pens. They belong in stories. The hospital staff had gathered discreetly at the windows. Erin Briggs clutched a small notepad where she had jotted details about Whisper's dietary needs, even though she knew Clemeth would ignore half of them. Sarah Holt leaned quietly against the nurse's station, her cardigan sleeves pushed to her elbows, watching her patient not just leave, but return. And June Halley stood apart, arms crossed, boots damp from the frost, the ever-present ache in her chest now eased. She hadn't spoken much that week, but today, as Clemeth passed her on his way out, she gave him a rare smile. "You'll be all right," she said softly. "You already are." Whisper had been taken home earlier that morning, loaded into Lucas's trailer with less resistance than anyone expected. But what no one anticipated was his return. That night, long after Clemeth had settled into his familiar chair by the fireplace and Marlin had gone to bed with a cup of chamomile tea, Whisper was gone. They found him the next morning, just as dawn cracked through the pine trees, casting golden fingers across the gravel road outside the hospital. He stood beside the emergency entrance, unmoving, hooves dusted with frost, his head low but alert, ears flicking at every noise from inside. He had walked the 8 miles from Clemeth's cabin alone, through the cold, through the dark, through memories. He had returned, not because he was lost, but because something in him believed the journey wasn't over. Dr. Estelle Ramsey, arriving early for a morning shift, was the first to spot him. She stood by the glass doors, steaming cup of coffee in hand, and watched the horse she had once refused entry, now waiting as if it belonged. She didn't call security. She didn't make a note in a report. Instead, she walked outside and sat on the bench nearby, the kind meant for waiting families, and simply kept him company until sunrise. By 7:15 a.m., Clemeth arrived. June had driven him in her truck. After receiving a call from the night security guard who had seen Whisper arrive just after midnight and curl up near the staff entrance like a loyal dog, Clemeth stepped out slowly, cane in hand, knees still stiff from recovery, and faced the animal he had raised, rescued, and somehow been rescued by in return. Whisper lifted his head, ears pricking. Then, without urgency, he stepped forward and touched his muzzle gently to Clemeth's chest. There were no theatrics. No neighs or stomping hooves, only the sound of a man's slow breath and a horse's gentle exhale. June watched them quietly, then turned back toward her truck. "I'll give you 2 a minute," she said. Whisper didn't hesitate when Clemeth turned. He walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, but beside. They left the hospital together, not like man and beast, but like 2 old souls finally finished with the place that had brought them back from the brink. In the days that followed, the town began to murmur. The tale spread, not in headlines or internet posts, but across bar counters, church pews, and diner booths. "Did you hear about the horse that saved the man? They say it waited all night. They say it walked back to make sure he was really coming." The story was retold again and again, changing slightly with each voice, each version bending a little more toward legend. Some said Whisper had guided the ambulance by pure instinct. Others claimed he had been trained. But those who had been there, June, Milo, Sarah, Erin, even Estelle, knew better. They knew the truth wasn't about training or fate. It was about something harder to name. Something older than language. Loyalty, grief, love that outlives words. 1 week later, on a quiet Sunday, Clemeth carved something new. His hands, though weaker, still remembered. The chisel found the grain of the mesquite, and slowly, patiently, he sculpted the silhouette of a Mustang standing in rain, head bowed, hooves planted, unwavering. He didn't name it. He didn't have to. Sometimes love doesn't speak. It waits. It stands in the rain. It watches the door. It remembers your face even when the world forgets your name. This story isn't just about a horse. It's about loyalty that outlives language, about showing up for those we love, even when no one asks us to. In a world where noise often drowns meaning, Whisper reminded us that actions, not words, carry the deepest truth. And maybe, just maybe, there's a whisper in your life too. A quiet companion, a friend who stayed, or a memory that still walks beside you. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on those silent bonds in your own life. And if you believe others need to hear this too, don't forget to share the story, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that speak straight to the soul.